The pain arrived before I did. Consciousness crept in slow and cruel, dragging me upward through layers of sleep so thick they felt like water. My skull throbbed with a rhythm that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with punishment. Each heartbeat sent a fresh spike behind my eyes, and the inside of my mouth tasted like ash and something floral and wrong, sweet in the way that poison is sweet, coating my tongue with a thickness I could not swallow away. I did not open my eyes yet. I had learned, after years of early morning healing shifts at Ashvale's border infirmary, that the body tells you the truth before the mind catches up. So I stayed still and I listened to what my body was saying. Hello friends. Before we journey deeper into Sarah's story, I invite you to subscribe and share in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence here matters. Now, let's continue. It was saying, something is wrong. The surface beneath me was silk. Cool, impossibly smooth, sliding against my skin with a luxury that had never once been part of my life. The cot in my healer's cottage was straw-stuffed linen. The sleeping mat in the festival dormitory had been coarse canvas that left impressions on your cheek. This, whatever this was, felt like the inside of a dream that belonged to someone far above my rank. I kept my eyes shut and reached for familiar things. The Blood Moon Festival had been the most significant event in the Northern Territory's calendar. 3 days of ceremony, tribute, and celebration. The one time each year when wolves from every pack, from the highland citadels down to the border settlements like mine, gathered under the same sky. As Ashvale's senior healer, I had worked every hour of it. Tending blistered feet and overexcited pups and 3 separate elders who had celebrated too enthusiastically on the first night. By the closing ceremony, every part of me had ached with a deep, own tiredness. The ceremonial cup had been passed at sundown. The traditional blend, elderflower, starroot, and something warm that tasted faintly of honey and pine. I had drunk it standing at the border pack table, surrounded by people I had known my whole life. And then, nothing. Not blurry. Not fragmented. Simply nothing, as though someone had reached into my memory and cut cleanly through it, leaving a white silence where ours should have been. My stomach turned over. Not from the throbbing in my head. From the silence. The air was wrong. I noticed it the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, an absence first, then an intrusion. Gone was the familiar scent of pine resin and dried herbs that had lived in my cottage walls for as long as I had. Gone was the cold, clean bite of Ashvale's border wind that pushed through the gap in my window every morning without apology. What reached me instead was something loud and deliberate. Cedar and iron and something underneath both, dark and animal and ancient. The scent of power at rest. Of a predator who had never once in its life needed to announce itself. My wolf stirred. Not in alarm. That was what frightened me most. She stirred the way she did when I came home, with recognition. With ease. I forced my eyes open. The room tilted before it steadied. Light poured through windows that reached from floor to ceiling in great sweeping panels, and beyond the glass, mountains rose out of silver morning mist in a range I had only ever seen from 50 miles south. The Highland Citadel. I had never been inside it. No wolf from a border pack had, without an explicit summons from the king himself. The chamber around me was vast and dark-toned, black stone walls carved with old territorial markings, silver-threaded drapes pooling on the floor, furniture built for permanence rather than comfort. A room that had never apologized for what it was. I looked down. A pale silk shift covered me, thin-strapped and foreign. My festival wrap, the deep green wool I had pinned at my shoulder with the copper brooch my mother left me, was gone. My healer's satchel was gone. My boots were gone. I pressed my fingers to my collarbone searching for the small iron charm I wore on a cord, the one Elder Marin had given me at my first healing certification, and found nothing around my neck except warmth. A specific, curved warmth. Raised slightly. Tender in a way that made my fingers freeze the moment they found it. I touched it carefully. A mark. Fresh. Shaped like a crescent with a secondary curve inside it. A pattern I had seen in the archive illustrations of pack bonding records, in the ceremonial texts I had studied for my healer's training. A pattern I had read about in the abstract, clinical way you read about something that happens to other wolves. My wolf did not stir this time. She went completely, terrifyingly still. The way prey goes still. The way something cornered goes still. I turned my head. He was beside me. One arm resting across the dark sheets, his hand lying open in the space between us, fingers loose and near my hip without touching. He was asleep, or had been. His chest rose and fell with the slow control of a man whose body never fully surrendered its guard, even unconscious. Dark hair pushed back from his face, the kind of jaw that looked carved rather than grown, a day's worth of shadow along it. Tattoos moved in dense, deliberate patterns up his forearm and wrist, not decorative, territorial. The white shirt he wore was open at the chest, and the body beneath it spoke of a life spent in combat and survived. A silver watch sat against the tattoos on his wrist, expensive and quiet, the way everything about him was quiet. I knew who he was. Every wolf in the Northern Territories knew Alpha King Kale Draven, even those of us who had never stood in the same territory as him. He had ruled the Northern Packs since he was 26, after his father's death, and he had spent the 7 years since making it very clear that his rule was not a conversation. 40 packs answered to him. 3 rival Alpha Lords had challenged him in those 7 years. None of them held their titles anymore. He was not cruel. That was what people always said when they tried to explain why the fear of him was different from ordinary fear. He was simply inevitable. And he was lying beside me. His eyes opened. Dark. Immediate. Fully aware in the space between one breath and the next. His gaze found me without searching, as though he had known exactly where I was even in sleep, and settled on my face with a weight that made my wolf press low and my spine go rigid. Then his eyes dropped to my neck. To the mark. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. He looked back at my face and said, in a voice that carried the particular quiet of a man who never needed to be loud. You don't remember. My stomach dropped through the floor. He did not look away. That was the first thing I noticed about Kale Draven in the full light of morning. He did not look away from things that made other people uncomfortable. He held my gaze with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that silence was more powerful than anything words could fill it with. I, on the other hand, could not seem to locate a single coherent thought. My hand was still pressed against the mark on my neck. The skin there pulsed faintly under my fingertips, warm in a way that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with something I did not yet have language for. My wolf had gone so still inside me she felt like a held breath. You're going to want to move your hand, Kale said. It'll ache less if you don't press on it. I moved my hand. Not because he told me to. Because he was right, and I hated that he was right, and the small rebellion of pretending otherwise required more composure than I currently possessed. I need you to explain what happened. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. All of it. From the beginning. He studied me for a moment longer, that dark, measuring gaze that felt less like scrutiny and more like calculation, then rose from the bed with the unhurried movement of a man who had never once been rushed by anything outside his own decision. He crossed to the chamber door and opened it without raising his voice. Send Riven. The man who arrived 3 minutes later was lean and silver-eyed, carrying a leather-bound record book with the careful grip of someone who understood that what was written inside it would matter. He introduced himself as Riven, the king's spy master, and he said it the way people say titles that have weight, plainly, without performance. He opened the book on the table near the window and turned it toward me. The record was made immediately following the ceremony, Riven said. 4 to 7 witnesses signed it before midnight. Pack elders, high lords, court officials, and 2 members of the Northern Council. I looked at the page. Columns of signatures, all dated, all time-stamped in the archival ink that bond records required under Northern law. At the top of the page, in the formal script of the court recorder, was a summary of events. Sarah Ashwood of Ashvale Border Pack. Blood Moon Bond Acceptance. Spoken in the old tongue. Witnessed and sealed. I don't speak the old tongue, I said. My voice was very flat. No documented Border Pack healer does, Riven agreed, without inflection. That is one of several details the king has asked me to investigate. I looked at Kale. He was standing near the window with his arms folded, watching me read, giving me space to absorb it without filling the silence with reassurance he had not yet earned the right to offer. I found that I respected that, reluctantly and against my better judgment. What exactly did I do? I asked. Walk me through it. Riven turned a page. You approached the blood moon circle alone, at the 3rd hour of the closing ceremony. You were not escorted or accompanied. You walked to the center of the ring without hesitation and stood there until Alpha King Draven was brought forward by his council. He paused. At which point you looked at him and spoke the full bonding declaration, both halves of it, in unbroken old tongue. Without prompting. Without error. The room was very quiet. The bond sealed upon completion of the words, Riven continued. The mark presented simultaneously on both parties. The court recorder confirmed the bond legally binding under Northern law at that moment. I sat with that for a long breath. And Northern law regarding blood moon bonds says. Permanent, Kale said from the window. He said it without apology, without gentleness, simply as the fact it was. Witnessed and spoken under the blood moon, the bond cannot be dissolved by legal means. It can only be severed by death. I looked at my hands. They were very steady. I was distantly proud of them for that. My wolf already knows, I said, mostly to myself. Yes, Kale said. Mine does too. It was such a simple answer. It landed like a stone in still water. I looked up at him. You didn't plan this. It was not a question. I had already reached that conclusion sitting on the edge of his bed trying to locate my panic, and finding, underneath it, the unmistakable absence of any manipulative motive in a man who, if he had wanted to trap a border pack healer into a bond, had approximately 40 more efficient ways of doing so. No, he said. Then we were both used. I stood up. My legs held, which I considered a personal victory. And whoever did this had access to the festival grounds, knowledge of the old tongue bonding ritual, and a reason to want this bond to happen without either of us understanding why. Riven and Kale exchanged a look, the kind that meant one of them already had a partial answer. The ceremonial drink, I said. That's what you're not telling me yet. Riven cleared his throat. The batch served at the border pack table has been flagged for examination. The physician is analyzing it now. What do you think you'll find? A memory-severing compound, Kale said. He held my gaze. Something that would explain why you have no recollection after the ceremonial cup, but were apparently fully present and coherent during the ceremony itself. My stomach went cold. Not from shock, from the specific horror of a theory that made complete sense. Someone had not just arranged this. Someone had planned it carefully enough to ensure that I would walk into that circle, speak those words, and then wake up the next morning with no idea why. They wanted me bound and blind. Who has access to the restricted festival stores? I asked. Riven's silver eyes held something careful. Someone with palace-level clearance. I stood very still in Alpha King Kale Draven's chamber, wearing silk that was not mine, bearing a mark I did not remember accepting, and understood for the first time that the danger I had woken up into was far larger than an accidental bond. Someone inside these walls had made me a piece in a game I did not yet know the rules of. And they had not counted on me wanting to learn them. Elder Marin arrived at the chamber door within the hour. She was a compact woman of 60-something winters, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of hands that had spent decades doing precise, careful work. As the Citadel's chief physician, she carried herself with the particular authority of someone whose expertise no alpha had ever successfully argued with, including the one currently standing beside the window. She set her case on the table, opened it without ceremony, and placed a small sealed vial in the center of the surface between us. Inside the vial, a dried residue clung to the glass. Pale gray. Faintly iridescent where the morning light caught it. Vale's root, Elder Marin said. The name landed in the room like a dropped blade. I knew it. Any healer trained past basic herbology knew it, not from practical application but from the restricted archive texts, the ones kept under lock in the senior healer's vault. Vale's root appeared in those pages under a single category heading, compounds prohibited under Northern Pack law. Possession, punishable by exile. Administration without consent, punishable by death. It was concentrated into the ceremonial blend. Elder Marin continued, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone delivering facts specifically to prevent herself from reacting to them. Dissolved completely. Undetectable by smell or taste. It would have taken effect within 90 minutes of consumption. What does it do? Cale asked, not because he didn't know, I suspected, but because he wanted it stated formally, on record, with Riven present. It severs the memory formation process, Elder Marin said. The person remains fully conscious and functional, capable of speech, movement, complex decision-making. But the brain stops encoding new memories from the moment the compound becomes active. Everything that occurs in that window, hours, sometimes longer depending on dosage, is simply never stored. She paused. When the compound clears, the person wakes with no recollection. Not fragmented memory. None. I sat very quietly with that. Fully conscious. Functional. Capable of complex decision-making. Which meant that whatever I had done at the Blood Moon Circle, walking in, speaking those words, looking at Cale's face, I had done while present. While aware. While capable of choosing otherwise. And I had chosen it anyway. That thought was too large to examine directly. I set it aside. The source? Cale asked. Elder Marin's expression shifted by a fraction. The Citadel's restricted medical stores. The compound is kept under dual lock in the lower archive, accessible only by myself, the senior council physician, and holders of a palace-level security clearance. Riven was already writing. That list, Cale said. 7 names, Riven confirmed. I'll have it cross-referenced against festival attendance and access logs within the hour. I watched them work, the clean, practiced efficiency of a king and his spy master navigating a crisis, and I noticed the thing neither of them said aloud, that one of those 7 names was someone Cale trusted. You do not give palace-level clearance to strangers. Elder Marin turned to me then, and something shifted in her gaze. Clinical assessment replaced by something more careful. Miss Ashwood, she said, I need to ask you about your family line. I looked at her. My parents died when I was 11. Border crossing accident. I was raised by the Pack Infirmary elder. Your mother's name? Lyra Ashwood. She was a healer too. Her mother before her. Elder Marin was very still. And your healing gifts, have they ever exceeded what standard wolf medicine would account for? I hesitated. There had been an incident 3 winters ago. A young packmate, Koran, had taken a rogue wolf's claws across his abdomen during a border incursion. Deep. The kind of wound that killed wolves with full medical intervention, let alone in a border settlement an hour from any real support. I had packed it, treated it, held my hands against the closing skin, and it had closed. In under an hour. Koran had walked out of the infirmary 2 days later. I had told no one. It had frightened me in a way I did not have words for. Once, I said carefully, I closed a wound that shouldn't have been closable. I assumed it was an anomaly. Elder Marin exhaled through her nose. She crossed to her case and retrieved a rolled piece of parchment, old enough that the edges had browned, and set it on the table between us. The Ashwood seal, she said, is a dormant bloodline trait. It passes through the maternal line of a single healer family, your family, and remains latent until activated. Activated by what? A blood moon bond, Elder Marin said, with the reigning Alpha King. The silence that followed had texture. When the seal activates, she continued, it generates a protective force tied to the bonded pair. Historically documented as capable of fortifying pack bonds across the entire Northern Territory, strengthening healing, reinforcing pack bonds, stabilizing the land itself during periods of conflict. She paused. The same force, if the bond is severed by external violence rather than the will of the bonded pair, reverses. The fracture goes outward. I stared at her. It destroys instead of protects. Catastrophically, she confirmed. According to the historical record, yes. I looked at Cale. He was watching me with that steady, dark attention, and for the first time I saw something beneath the control. Not fear. Something more complex. The expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about a situation he had not chosen. Someone knew, I said. They knew what I was. They arranged the bonds specifically to use my bloodline as either a weapon or a bargaining piece. Yes, Cale said. And they needed me not to remember, I continued, so that I would panic and run. Or refuse the bond publicly. Or give someone grounds to separate us by force. Any of which, Riven said quietly, would trigger the fracture. I pressed my palms flat against the table. Around my neck, the mark pulsed once, warm and deliberate, as though it was listening. I was not a healer who had stumbled into the wrong bed. I was a key that someone had stolen, shaped, and tried to use without my knowledge. The difference between those two things was the only thought keeping my hands steady. He arrived before noon. Riven brought the news with the particular stillness of a man delivering something unpleasant but not unexpected. Alpha Lord Soellen Voss of the Eastern Pax had entered the Citadel's outer gates with 20 armed guards and a formal declaration sealed in Eastern wolf iron, the kind of seal that meant the document inside carried legal weight under Interpac law and could not be ignored without political consequence. Cale read the declaration without visible reaction. Then he handed it to me. I read it twice. The language was careful, even sympathetic. It expressed deep concern for the welfare of a border pack healer who had been found, under unclear circumstances, bonded to the Alpha King following a festival at which her memory had been compromised. It called for an immediate independent review of the bond's legitimacy. It formally requested that Sarah Ashwood be released to neutral territory, for her own protection, pending that review. Neutral territory meaning, as Cale had already told me, Soellen Voss's own Eastern holdings. He makes it sound reasonable, I said. He always does, Cale replied. The Great Hall was larger than anything Ashvale's border settlement had prepared me for. Stone vaulted and silverlit, with the territorial markings of 40 packs carved into the walls in bands that rose from floor to ceiling. Pack representatives occupied tiered seating along both sides. At the far end, the council table held 7 elders whose combined authority was the only thing in the Northern Territories that technically outranked the Alpha King's word. I walked in beside Cale. I had borrowed a healer's tunic from Elder Marin, deep grey wool, properly fitted, with the copper border pack trim at the cuffs that identified my rank. Not royal. Not elevated. Exactly what I was. I had decided, standing in the physician's chamber while Elder Marin offered me something more formal, that the worst thing I could do in that hall was pretend to be something other than a border healer who had woken up 3 days ago with no memory and a mark on her neck. My wolf walked tall. I let her. The room reacted the way rooms do when something unexpected walks into them. A shift in posture, a collective intake of breath, whispers moving through the tears like wind through grass. Every eye dropped to the mark on my neck. I kept mine forward. Soellen Voss was already standing when we entered. He was handsome the way deliberate things are handsome, constructed, refined, each feature arranged to project exactly the impression he intended. Tall, broad-shouldered, with copper-brown hair and pale eyes that held warmth so practiced it had almost become genuine. He wore the Eastern Pack colors with the ease of someone who had never once questioned his own authority. He looked at me and smiled. Gentle. Concerned. Miss Ashwood. His voice carried the hall without effort. I'm relieved to see you well. I was worried, given the circumstances. My wolf snarled so immediately and completely that I had to work to keep the expression off my face. Thank you, I said pleasantly. He turned his concern to the council and began his formal challenge. It was, I had to admit, masterfully constructed. He cited Northern bonding law, specifically the clause requiring that both parties enter a blood moon bond in full cognitive clarity. He referenced Elder Marin's own finding about the Veil's route without once naming her as his source, which meant he already had one inside the Citadel. He built the argument carefully, layer by layer, each point resting on the last like stones in a wall. By the time he finished, 2 council elders were nodding. Cale stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed Elder Marin's formal report on the council table, followed by Riven's witnessed account of the investigation, followed by a single document that made the room go very quiet. The compound was sourced from within this citadel, Kale said. From stores accessible only to palace-cleared personnel. Miss Ashwood was not intoxicated. She was deliberately targeted. The bond she accepted was spoken in full old tongue with 4 to 7 witnesses present, a cognitive feat that requires precise, conscious command. He looked at the counsel. If her capacity was compromised, she would not have been capable of completing those words without a single error. The record confirms she made none. The counsel conferred in low voices. Llewellyn accepted the ruling that followed, bond upheld, his petition denied, with a smile that did not reach those pale eyes. He inclined his head to Kale. Then he looked at me one final time. I hope you find the answers you're looking for, Miss Ashwood, he said. Truly. My wolf pressed forward. I held her back and smiled instead. After the session, Kale led me back through a narrow passage behind the great hall, older stone, less traveled. Lit by iron-bracketed torches rather than the citadel's silver sconces. He walked at an even pace that matched mine without appearing to adjust for it. He knew about the Vale's route before today, I said. Yes. Which means whoever accessed those stores told him. One of the 7 names on Riven's list. Yes. I walked in silence for a moment. He didn't actually want me free. No, Kale said. He wanted you frightened enough to run, or controlled enough to be used. Neutral territory would have been a cell with better curtains. I thought about the smile. The practiced warmth. The way he had said I hope you find the answers as though he already knew I wouldn't, because he intended to make sure of it. The investigation, I said. The 7 names. How long? Riven estimates by nightfall. We reached the passage's end. Kale stopped at the door and I found something in my coat pocket, a small folded square of paper. My own handwriting. I had not put it there. I unfolded it. Don't run from him. You chose this for a reason. Trust what your wolf already knows. I stood very still. Read it twice. Folded it again. What is it? Kale asked. I looked at him, at the mark on his wrist that mirrored the one on my neck, at the measured patience in his face, at the man who had moved to intercept me that night before the bomb sealed, not to claim me but to check if I was safe. Something I need to think about, I said. I kept it in my fist the entire walk back. The archive record arrived at dusk. Riven placed it on the table in Kale's study, a long, low-ceilinged room lined floor to ceiling with territorial maps and bound case histories, and stepped back with the expression of a man who had read the contents and understood their weight. I was present because Kale had asked me to be. That small fact, asked, not summoned, not instructed, sat somewhere in my chest with quiet significance. The record was the court archivist's full account of the blood moon ceremony. Not the formal bond registration Riven had shown me that morning, but the raw account, the one written in real time by the observer stationed at the circle's edge, recording everything that occurred for the permanent territorial archive. Kale read it first. Then he set it in front of me without comment. I found the relevant passage on the second page. At the 3rd hour, a female wolf, subsequently identified as Sarah Ashwood of Ashvale Border Pack, entered the Blood Moon Circle from the northern approach, unescorted. Alpha King Draven observed her entry from the eastern platform. He immediately descended from the platform and moved toward the circle's perimeter at pace. He reached the boundary at the moment the subject completed the first clause of the bonding declaration. Under Blood Moon law, no individual may enter or disrupt the circle once a declaration has begun. Alpha King Draven halted at the boundary. The declaration was completed. The bond sealed. I read it twice. Then I set it down. You tried to reach me, I said. I thought you were confused, Kale said. He was standing at the window, his back half turned, watching the mountain range go dark as the last light left it. Or in distress. You were a border pack healer alone at a royal ceremony. It should not have been possible for you to speak those words. I thought something had gone wrong. Something had. Yes. But not the way I assumed. He turned from the window. By the time I reached the circle, you had already spoken the first clause. I couldn't enter without violating the ceremony legally. So I stood there. A pause. And I watched you finish what you started. I thought about that. About what it must have looked like. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories stopped at the boundary of his own ceremony, watching a woman he had never met bind herself to him with perfect, unbroken old tongue. What did you do after? I asked. I made sure you were safe, he said. You lost consciousness immediately after the bond sealed, the compound clearing your system, most likely. I carried you to these chambers. Elder Marin examined you. I sat in that window seat, he nodded toward the bench beneath the glass, and stayed until I was certain you were breathing normally. He said it without sentiment. As a fact. The way he said most things. You didn't, I began. No, he said. Simply, directly, before I finished. I did not. My wolf exhaled. I looked at the window seat. It was a narrow thing, stone-based, cushioned in dark fabric, built for looking out rather than sleeping in. He had spent the night in a window seat watching over a stranger who had accidentally bound herself to him, and had not once considered doing anything other than exactly that. I was running out of ways to hold him at a careful distance. Riven returned an hour later with the narrowed list. 7 names had become 3. Cross-referenced against festival access logs, restricted store entry records, and the timing of Soellen Voss's arrival intelligence, which had been too fast, too specific to be anything but an inside source. 3 names remained. Cale looked at the list. Something moved across his face and was controlled before it fully formed. Which one? I asked. He looked at me. Decided something. Commander Aldrich, he said. The name meant nothing to me. But the way Cale said it meant everything. The specific flatness of a man saying the name of someone he trusted completely, in a sentence about betrayal. His head of security, Riven said quietly. 22 years of service to the Draven line. I did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Cale set the list on the table. We'll confirm it before we move. Tonight, Riven said. I can have the secondary logs cross-checked within the hour. Cale nodded once and Riven left. We were alone in the study. The maps on the walls marked territories in faded ink, borders negotiated and redrawn over generations, some in red where they had cost lives to establish. I looked at them and thought about a man who had ruled all of it since 26, who kept his spymaster close and his trust closer, and had just learned that the closest circle had a fracture in it. I'm sorry, I said. He looked at me with something that was almost surprise. For what? That it's someone you trusted. That's a different kind of loss than a stranger's betrayal. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally. It is. The study lamp between us threw warm light across the maps, across his hands resting on the table's edge, across the mark on his wrist that matched the one on my neck. My wolf was doing something insufferable, pressing forward, content, certain, and I was running out of reasons to pull her back. I reached into my pocket and took out the note. Set it on the table between us. I found this in the pocket of the shift I was wearing, I said. My handwriting. I don't remember writing it. He read it without touching it. Read it again. Then he looked up at me with an expression that, for the first time since I had opened my eyes in his chamber, had nothing guarded in it at all. I held his gaze and did not look away. Elder Marin summoned me before breakfast. The archive vault sat 3 levels below the main citadel, carved directly into the highland rock, cold in the way that deep places are cold, the kind that settles into your bones and stays. Iron torch brackets lined the passage down, and the air smelled of old parchment and the particular dryness of things preserved deliberately, kept from the world for reasons that mattered. Elder Marin was already there when I arrived. She stood at the central table with a single candle and a piece of parchment so old the edges had gone translucent. She did not greet me. She simply waited for me to reach the table, then turned the parchment so I could read it. The script was old tongue, The same language I had apparently spoken fluently in the Blood Moon Circle while a compound designed to erase my memories worked through my bloodstream. The same language I had never once formally studied. I could read every word. That fact settled over me with the quiet horror of something that had always been true, only now confirmed. When the blood of the old healers bonds beneath the blood moon with the king who holds the north, the seal awakens. Bound in willing choice, it fortifies. Severed by outside force, it fractures. The north holds or falls on the moment between. I read it 3 times. The candle between us did not flicker. The seal activates through the bond, Elder Marin said. But it requires the bond to be genuine, entered by the will of the Ashwood line, not compelled or coerced. That is why someone needed you to walk in of your own accord. She paused. And why they needed you not to remember doing it. Because if I remembered choosing it, I said slowly, I would understand what I was choosing. And they needed me terrified. Running. Or demanding the bond be severed publicly. Any of which, Elder Marin confirmed, qualifies as outside force under the prophecy's terms. The severance does not have to be violent. It simply cannot be the willing choice of both bonded parties. I straightened. They needed one of us to break it against the other's will. Yes. I thought about Soellen Voss standing in the great hall with his practiced smile, calling for my release to neutral territory. About how reasonable he had made it sound. About how, if I had woken that first morning without Cale's steadiness and Riven's records and Elder Marin's precision, I might have demanded exactly that, loudly, publicly, with the full legal weight of a coerced bonding claim behind me. They had built the trap perfectly. They had just underestimated how quickly I ask questions. Does Cale know the full text? I asked. He knows the prophecy exists, Elder Marin said. He has not seen the complete translation until now. She looked at me carefully. I thought you should see it first. It concerns your bloodline. What you do with that information is your decision. I took the parchment, folded it with the care it deserved, and went to find the Alpha King. He was in his study when I arrived, and he was not alone. Commander Aldrich stood before the central table, a broad, grey-haired wolf of perhaps 55, built like a man who had spent his entire life in service to something larger than himself. He held his posture straight even now, even with Riven positioned near the door and Cale standing across from him with an expression that had gone completely, dangerously still. I stopped in the doorway. Cale glanced at me, a single look that said stay, and I stayed. I'm not going to ask if you did it, Cale said to Aldrich. Riven's logs are complete. I'm going to ask why. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who had been carrying something too long. Your father made a promise to the previous line, he said. Before you were born. If his heir proved unfit, the Draven rule would revert. I watched you take this throne at 26 and hold it without fracture for 7 years. He paused. But the Ashwood seal changes the calculation. A king bonded to an Ashwood healer cannot be challenged. Not politically, not by strength, not by law. The power becomes permanent. I thought, he stopped. You thought you were preventing a dynasty, Cale said quietly. I thought I was protecting choice, Aldrich said. I was wrong about what that meant. The silence afterward was not angry. It was heavier than anger, the specific weight of a long loyalty broken by a single wrong conviction. Cale stripped the command from him in 4 sentences. No rage. No punishment beyond the removal itself. He told Aldrich he would be held in the northern quarters pending a formal council review, and that his 22 years of genuine service would be considered in that process. Aldrich nodded once. Riven escorted him out. I set the prophecy parchment on the table. Cale read it without sitting down. When he finished, he was very still. He already sent word to Soellen, I said. Before you confronted him. Yes. Which means Soellen knows the full terms now. He knows the bond can't be broken by force without triggering the fracture, and he knows that makes it worthless to him as a political weapon unless, I stopped. Unless he causes the fracture deliberately, Cale finished. And lets the North destabilize. Then moves into the chaos as the alternative authority. The room was very cold. His calling a territory summit, Riven said from the doorway. His expression was careful. The declaration arrived while you were with Aldrich. A formal gathering of all Alpha Lords to review the bond's validity before the full council. Within 3 days. Cale looked at me. If you refuse, I said, it looks like guilt. If you attend, he has every major power in the Northern Territories in one location and a plan we haven't fully seen yet. You don't have to be there, Cale said. If I don't appear, I replied, it looks like coercion. You need me standing beside you, publicly, clearly unafraid. I held his gaze. So make sure we both walk out of it. He looked at me for a long moment, that unguarded expression I had first seen when I left the note between us, and said quietly, when this is finished, I want to show you something. I waited. What the Northern Territories look like when nothing is burning. The Territory Summit convened at midday. Every Alpha Lord with standing in the Northern Territories had answered Suellen's call, some out of genuine political concern, some out of the particular curiosity that gathers when power is openly questioned, and some, I suspected, because they wanted to see what a border pack healer looked like standing beside the Alpha King in the hall where that question was being asked. I walked in beside Cale. The same grey wool tunic. The same copper-trimmed cuffs. The mark visible on my neck, not covered, not diminished. My wolf walked the way she had in every room since this began, quietly, deliberately, certain of something my mind was still catching up to. The hall held more people than it had during Suellen's first challenge. The tiered seating was full, the standing areas behind packed with advisors and guard contingents and the kind of observers who take careful notes. At the council table, all 7 elders were present. Suellen Voss stood at the advocate's position with 2 legal advisors flanking him, his copper-brown hair neat, his pale eyes carrying that practiced warmth. He looked at me when I entered. Smiled. I looked away first only because I had someone more important to watch. Cale presented the formal defense without oratory. He simply placed facts in sequence, the physician's finding, the archive investigation, Aldrich's confession, the prophecy text, and let the council read them in order. His voice carried the hall without effort, each sentence landing with the clean weight of something that did not require decoration. Suellen's challenge was more elegant than his first. He had refined it with the additional intelligence Aldrich had provided, reframing the argument not around coercion but around stability. A king bonded to a bloodline power of this magnitude, he argued, without full territorial consultation, created a concentration of authority that the Interpack Council Charter was specifically designed to prevent. It was not entirely wrong. That was what made it dangerous. 2 council elders were leaning forward. I watched their faces and understood that Cale's facts, however clean, were not going to be enough on their own. I stood up. Cale glanced at me, the briefest look, assessing, then giving ground. He stepped back. I had not prepared words. I was a healer. I prepared treatments, not speeches. So I said what I would have said to a frightened patient, the plainest possible version of the truth. I told them what I remembered and what I did not. I told them about the veil's root and what it does and how I knew, because I was a trained healer and this was my professional knowledge being used against me. I told them about the Ashwood seal in plain language, stripped of prophecy dramatics, described the way I would describe any compound or condition, mechanism, effect, consequence. I told them that the man beside me had tried to reach me at the circle before the bond sealed, had spent the night in a window seat making sure I was safe, and had offered me, in private, to find a way to dissolve the bond voluntarily if I chose it. A man who arranged this, I said, does not do those things. Then I sat down. The hall was very quiet for a moment. Then the doors blew open. It happened in the space between one breath and the next, the coordinated efficiency of something planned in precise detail. 12 figures in Eastern Pack colors moved through the hall's entrance simultaneously, blades drawn, not hesitating. Not announcing. Simply moving. Suellen's expression did not change. That was how I knew he had expected this. The political challenge had never been the weapon. It had been the gathering mechanism, the reason to fill one room with every significant power in the Northern Territories. Cale moved before I fully understood what was happening. Not away. Toward me. He covered the distance between us in 2 strides and put himself between my body and the nearest attacker with a speed that was not performance. It was instinct, deep and immediate, the bond pulling him before strategy could intervene. "Stay close," he said. Not a command. A request. His warriors engaged. The hall became a contained chaos, tight, close, brutal in the way that indoor combat always is. The tiered seating emptied as pack representatives scrambled for cover or joined the defense. The council elders were pulled back by their guards. Steel rang against stone. A blade came for Kale's back. He was engaged, both hands, full attention forward, no angle to intercept it. The attacker came from the left, fast and low, and I saw it before anyone else did because I was standing behind him and I was watching. I had no weapon. I had no combat training. I had hands that had closed wounds that should have killed, and I had a mark on my neck that burned suddenly, completely, like sunlight focused through glass. Something erupted from my palms. I did not choose it. It chose the moment, a wave of golden silver light, warm rather than violent, that expanded outward from me in a pulse that took perhaps 2 seconds to cross the hall. It did not harm. It clarified. Every attacker in the room stumbled, disoriented, as though the ground had shifted beneath them. Every defender steadied simultaneously, footing certain, vision sharp. The hall went still. The attackers stopped. Not from pain, from the specific confusion of a body whose nervous system had just been briefly, completely overridden. Kale's guard took them in the silence that followed. I stood with my hands out in front of me. Golden light fading from my palms in slow threads. Every person in the hall was staring at me. The council elders. The alpha lords. The pack representatives pressed against the walls. Soellen Voss, for the first time since I had met him, was not smiling. Kale turned. He reached me in 2 steps and took both my hands in his, not examining them, not studying the fading light. Simply holding on. The council voted in the silence that followed without a single dissenting voice. The citadel was quiet for the first time in days. Soellen Voss had been taken into formal territorial custody within the hour following the summit, escorted by a joint contingent of council guards and Kale's own warriors, his legal advisors detained separately for questioning. His sleeper faction had been subdued without further casualties. The Alpha Lords who had attended the summit had dispersed to their respective territories carrying witness accounts that would travel faster than any formal declaration. The Northern Territories knew what had happened in that hall. They knew what had come from my hands. Riven had given me a quiet nod on his way out, the closest thing to warmth I had seen from him, and Elder Marin had checked my pulse, examined my palms with professional thoroughness, and told me to eat something and sleep before I did anything else important. I had done neither. I sat alone in my assigned chamber with the lamp turned low, my hands resting in my lap, and I waited. Not for anything specific. I simply had the particular feeling of someone standing at the edge of something large, waiting for it to resolve into a shape they could understand. And then my memory came back. Not in fragments. Not in the careful pieces that had been returning since the first morning, a flash of firelight here, an echo of Kale's voice there. All of it. Complete and sudden, like a door flung open rather than eased, flooding the room of my mind with everything the veil's root had sealed away. I pressed both hands flat against my knees and stayed very still and let it come. The Blood Moon Festival at its 3rd hour. The ceremonial cup, the taste of elderflower and honey and something underneath both that I had not recognized then but recognized now. The warmth of it spreading through me, and the knowledge, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that something in the drink was wrong. I had been moving toward the dormitory when I saw him. Not on a dais. Not performing the business of kingship. Kale was crouched at the festival's northern edge, at the boundary where the celebration lights thinned into shadow, beside a wolf pup, perhaps 4 years old, who had separated from his family in the crowd and was sitting on the cold ground crying with the complete, committed despair of a small creature who believes it has been lost forever. Kale spoke to him at eye level. Patient and unhurried, with the particular gentleness of someone who was not performing gentleness for an audience. There was no audience. No one was watching. His guards were 20 feet back and turned away. He was simply a very powerful man choosing, in a moment that cost him nothing politically and gained him nothing publicly, to make a frightened child feel safe. The pup's parents found them 3 minutes later. Cale stood, said something brief to the father, and walked away before the gratitude could fully form. No acknowledgement sought. No moment made of it. My wolf had reacted before my mind formed a single coherent thought. That one. Certain. Complete. The way deep things are certain, not argued into, simply known. I remembered walking to the circle. The old tongue words arriving in my mouth the way breathing arrives, not retrieved but simply present, unlocked by the bond beginning to form between us. I remembered looking at Cale's face across the circle as I finished speaking, seeing the shock in his expression, the split second of pure unguarded reaction before the control returned. I remembered thinking, with the compound already beginning its work at the edges of my consciousness, I will not remember this tomorrow. So I need to leave myself a message before I can't. I had found a scrap of paper in my festival wrap. Written the note in the last minutes of clarity I had. Tucked it into the hem of the shift I had been given to change into, somewhere my hands would find it. Then the memory closed, and I had woken up in a stranger's bed wearing silk that wasn't mine. I sat with the fullness of it, every piece of the last 3 days suddenly oriented around a center point that had been there from the beginning. The fear had been real. The confusion had been real. But underneath both, in the part of me that had spoken old tongue without learning it and activated a power I did not know I carried, something had been entirely, quietly sure. I got up. Crossed the corridor. Knocked on the door of Cale's study. He was alone, seated at the table with the summit aftermath documents spread before him, the formal record of Soalan's detention, the council's vote, the territorial notifications Riven had already dispatched. He looked up when I entered with that immediate, complete attention that I had stopped finding unnerving somewhere around the 3rd day and started finding simply true to him. I sat down across the table. My memory came back, I said. All of it. He went very still. I told him what I had seen. The pup at the festival's edge. The choice his unguarded moment had triggered in me. The words arriving in the old tongue like something remembered rather than learned. The note written in the last minutes before the compound took the rest. I set the folded paper on the table between us, the same note I had shown him in the corridor 3 days ago, that I had kept in my pocket through the great hall and the summit, and the moment golden light had come from my hands in front of every power in the Northern Territories. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. I was going to let you go, he said. Once it was safe. I had already asked Riven to research voluntary dissolution, a process that both parties could enter willingly, without triggering the prophecy's terms. I would have given you that choice. I know, I said. You know. That's why I'm sitting here instead of packing. The study lamp threw warm light across the maps on the walls, across his hands resting at the table's edge, across the mark on his wrist. My wolf was perfectly, completely still, not waiting, not pressing. Settled, the way a thing is settled when it has arrived somewhere it intended to reach. Cale rose from the table, crossed to my side and stopped in front of me, close enough that the cedar and iron scent that had frightened me 3 mornings ago now felt like the most familiar thing I knew. Are you certain? He asked. I stood. Met his eyes directly. I was certain before I knew I was certain, I said. I'm only now catching up to myself. Something in his expression released, not dramatically, not with the performance of a man who had been waiting for those words. Simply the specific softening of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. He reached up and touched the mark on my neck. Lightly. A question rather than a claim. My wolf sang once, bright and clear, and went quiet. We stood at the study window as first light broke over the highland range, silver pink cracking along the mountain ridges, mist lifting off the valleys below in slow columns, the Northern Territories emerging from the dark the way they apparently did every morning, indifferent to what had burned the night before. You said you wanted to show me this, I said. I did. It's extraordinary. Yes. He was looking at me rather than the mountains when he said it. I let that be what it was. My wolf let it be what it was. The mark on my neck was warm and unhurried, and the power that had erupted from my hands the night before rested quietly now, present but patient, no longer a stranger inside my own skin. She had woken up in a stranger's bed with no memory and a mark she did not remember accepting. She was standing at his window watching the sunrise with the same mark and the full knowledge of every choice that had led her here. Both versions of her had known exactly what she was doing. The end, for now. If this story found you at the right moment, if Sao's courage spoke to something in you, if Kale's quiet steadiness was the kind of strength you needed to see today, then you are exactly the audience this story was made for. Please subscribe so you never miss the next chapter, the next story, the next world we build together in this space. Every subscriber is a reader who chose to stay, and just like Sao, choosing to stay is never the small thing it looks like from the outside. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Whether it is midnight in Lagos or morning in Manila or a quiet afternoon somewhere in between, your presence here genuinely matters. Share this story with one person who loves enemies to lovers, who needs a heroine who asks questions instead of running, who has ever woken up uncertain and chosen to stay anyway. We will see you in the next one. The Northern Territories are not finished with Sarah Ashwood yet.